I'm reading from Psalms 86 if you want to follow along. Hear me, Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Guard my life, for I am faithful to you. Save your servant who trusts you. You are my God. Have mercy on me, Lord, for I call to you all day long. Bring joy to your servant, Lord, for I put my trust in you. You, Lord, are forgiving and good, abounding in love to all who call to you. Hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for mercy. For when I am in distress, I call to you, because you answer me. Among the gods there is none like you, Lord. No deeds can compare with yours. All the nations you have made will come and worship before you, Lord. They will bring glory to your name, for you are great and do marvelous deeds. You alone are God. Teach me your way, Lord, that I may rely on your faithfulness. Give me an undivided heart, that I may fear your name. I will praise you, Lord my God, with all my heart. I will glorify your name forever. For great is your love toward me, and you have delivered me from the depths, from the realm of the dead. Arrogant foes are attacking me, O God. Ruthless people are trying to kill me. They have no regard for you, but you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Turn to me and have mercy on me. Show your strength in behalf of your servant. Save me because I serve you, just as my mother did. Give me a sign of your goodness, that my enemies may see it and be put to shame. For you, Lord, have helped me and comforted me.
Thank you, Samuel, for doing that. All right. So today we're going to be going over John 4. I was originally going to do 17, and then I met with Kevin, threw him a curveball, and went back to 4. I titled this one Living with Pagans because there's a joke that goes around my house almost every dinner time when we as a family take the time to sit down and actually pray together and spend time together, that we'll start eating dinner, or somebody will sit down at the table and they'll start eating first, just like it happened last night. And what do we say, boys? What are we, pagans? Do we not pray around here? Right? And it's kind of a joke. So I had to throw that in there, and that's kind of the title of this. But as we get into it, as people know, John 4, it's about Jesus at the well, the Samaritan woman, right? And I had him read Psalm 86 because I think the most imperative thing that we can have just as Christians and followers of Christ is to be open to being taught. Regardless of the amount of time that we've spent in the Bible, regardless of the amount of scholars that we've been around, regardless of how much we read, you still have to have an open mind and a heart to be taught and to learn and to glean from what Christ is telling us. Because the truth of the matter is, as Christians, as believers in Jesus Christ, as baptized followers, we have been saved from the depths of Sheol. Is that right, Kevin? Sheol? Sheol, right? We've been saved from the depths of hell. From that, right? That's our whole intent, is to be the followers of that and to go forth. So I thought this spoke well to that. So let's look at the verses here in chapter 4. Let's start off at verse 7. A woman of Samaria came down to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to find food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, Give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given to you living water. The woman said to him, Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get this living water? Are you greater than my father Jacob, who gave us this well, and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? Jesus answered and said to her, Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into the everlasting life. And the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor have to come up to and come here and draw. And Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." So as we read through this, it never kind of really hit me until sitting down, doing some deliberation and some discussion and whatnot, that here a woman, a Samaritan, is talking to Jesus in a time when these two sects did not intersect, right? Did not come together. So I seriously doubt that she, as a Samaritan, is talking to Jesus in this profound, nice way, him being a Jew, her being a Samaritan. I tend to read a little bit of sarcasm in her answers here and in the questions that she asks him, right? When it says this stuff, the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water that I may not thirst or have to come up here and draw water." I mean, it's on top of a mountain. She's having to go to the well for water every time that she's coming back, right? How laborious that may be. That must have been, right? When I read this, it reminds me of a thing that before I went to Afghanistan, we learned, we were told of sometimes the help that you provide is not the help that people need. In a village that some of the forces were at, they went and they built a well that was close in town, so the women didn't have to go down to the river and draw water and bring it back because it was so time-consuming, so laborious, something that was going on. So they built this well so the women wouldn't have to do it. The women, later on, come to find out the well kept getting sabotaged, kept getting blown up, kept getting destroyed. And come to find out the reason that was happening is that the women wanted to get down to the river. They wanted to get away from the men. They wanted to go down in their groups and talk and discuss and be away from it. So the well was like this curse for them. They're like, "I can never escape this small village. Let us go to the river," right? I seriously doubt that's what she was meaning in this, like that she loved going to the well, and that it was the way to get out of town. So when you look at it through the vision or through the eyes of perhaps some sarcastic speech, it kind of takes on a different meaning of this woman's not being really, one, she doesn't recognize who Jesus is, right? Like, why would she? Here this Jew is sitting right by her well that she has to go draw to in this foreign land of people that she's not interacting with. And so I don't think there was this much mutual respect, especially on her end, not knowing who Christ was, of this Jew that's sitting here asking her for a drink of water when he doesn't even have a pail to draw it out of, right? So then let's explore and discuss what exactly are Samaritans, right? So if you go back into 1 Kings 11 and 12, it tells you how the Samaritans came about, right, with the dividing of the kingdom, of how after Solomon dies, the kingdom is split into the north and to the south, right? Both of them end up falling and going separate ways and falling away from God and the Jewish teachings. But the north goes much more quickly. Its capital is in Samaria, right? The town of Samaria. As soon, like as it says in Kings 11, as soon as they get up there and they're having conflict and people are starting to go astray, what's the first thing that Jeroboam does? He makes a golden calf for them to worship, right? And where is it at? It's on the mountain that Jesus is at, by Jacob's well. This is where their temple was at, right? And they fall away immediately. Well, it only takes a little while before they are completely overran and conquered by the Syrians. Not only that, then when they are conquered and they're overtaken, almost immediately they start intermarrying with the Gentile pagans, if you will, of the Assyrians with the Jews, right? Well, later on, the southern kingdom falls to the Babylonians, and what's really interesting about that is when Nehemiah comes in later on, who are the first people that oppose Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of the temple? It's the Samaritans. Their own kind-ish, if you will, right? Their own denomination of the Jewish people and the Jewish faith. When you look at where they were located, you can see here on the left, that's where Samaria was in the northern kingdom. And you can see the southern kingdom there of Israel. And then you look in Jesus' time, they both kind of congregated and moved a little bit further south, but they were predominantly located in that same area. And so later on, as we see, or as the script shows when we're reading through John 4, when Jesus is going from Jerusalem up to the Sea of Galilee, he must go through Samaria. He has to cross through this land, and that's when he comes into this interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well. So we continue reading, and I think this is when the light bulb clicks on and the ability to be taught and to learn comes in. And so Jesus says to her, "You have said well, I have no husbands, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one with whom you are with now is not your husband, in which you speak truly." And the woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews said that in Jerusalem is a place where one ought to worship." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. You know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all these things." And Jesus said to her, "I whom speak to you am he." Right? So even though Jesus is telling her these prophecy things about, hey, I know that you had 5 husbands, I know that the person that you're living with now and everything else, she's still saying, well, that's great and good news that this is happening and everything else. But when the Messiah comes, he'll take care of all of this stuff and it'll become clear. So what this kind of tells me in this text is that obviously she was living in sin, right? Outside of the teachings and the laws of the Jews, right? Hence the living out of wedlock and then having five husbands prior. But she still knew what the law was. She still knew what the teachings of the Jewish faith were, because she obviously knew that the Messiah was coming. So even though she was a Samaritan mixed with this Gentile type understanding, she still had deep within her an understanding of what the law was, what the teachings were, what Christ's or the Messiah's coming meant. This in particular speaks loud and clear to me in a lot of ways. My grandfather was married 5 times, and when he passed away, he was living with a woman that was not his wife, right? And so I read that, and I'm like, wow, that strikes close to home. Real close, right? And then I think to myself, like this Samaritan woman, was my grandfather not understanding of the word and the teachings? I'll say as an early life and through his growth, I would probably say, yes, that is probably true, that he was very, very far away from the word. But as with most of us, the older you get, the more you reflect, the more you look back on your life and say, wow, I really mucked that thing up. He drew nearer, and by the time of his passing, I truly believe that he had a greater understanding and a much, much deeper faith that he came back to. And I draw a lot of similarities there in this. And so when we look at the Samaritans and what they believe, and these Gentile pagans, if you will, to a certain extent, this mixed group of people, I started researching and just kind of thinking to myself, what do they do? How would this Samaritan woman know about these teachings if she wasn't following the laws? Well, if you look at the Samaritan thing, they believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, right? The Torah, if you will. They don't call it that. The Samaritans don't. I can't remember the word. But essentially it was the Torah. She said that we worship here on this mountain, while you, the Jews, tell us that we need to worship in Jerusalem. The mountain that she's talking about is Gerizim, right? And it's talked about in 19 and 21, and you can read the passage here that I just went over, right? But I find it really interesting that there was these specific locations that they had to go to in order to worship, in order to be close to God, right? And I find it interesting when you look up the definition of what a Samaritan was. It says this: they establish as their center of worship a temple on Mount Gerizim, claiming it is where Moses had originally intended for the Israelites to worship. They had their own unique version of the 5 books written by Moses, and basically the Pentateuch. and they rejected the writings of the prophets of the Jews and traditions. The Samaritans saw themselves as the true descendants of Israel and preservers of the true religion, while considering the Jerusalem temple and the Levitical priesthood illegitimate. So when you read through this, what does that sound like in modern day? Does that resonate with some other faiths and other denominations, if you will? They were more revolted than just Gentiles. Why? Because they were this mix. Because they kind of keep some of our traditions. They kind of believe in this stuff, but they're going to bring in their own things, their own faiths. Which I think resonates a lot with modern Christianity to a certain extent. Samaria still exists today. There's the temple on Gerizim. What's left of it, the steps that led up to it, the foundation that's there. There's still about 900 people, and they still have their own priests and their own traditions, and they still do their own customs, their own mix of Judaism and Gentile beliefs, which I thought was fascinating because it kind of seems like, oh, well, this is something of old that went away. But it never really did, and it really hasn't. And so I look at this version of this, and I see this mix of Jewish faith and Gentile faith. I look at the definition of a Samaritan, and I look at all of this, and it, as I just said, it reflects into my own life, my own bloodline. And what does it mean with living with pagans, right? And when I jokingly say this with my children, what are we really talking about? And it makes me reflect. What are the things that I find revolting when it comes to faith? And I wonder if we've ever just stopped and thought to ourselves, what do we find revolting? What are those will not do kind of things? Right? And how does that implicate and imply into our own lives? It's different for everybody because we all come from different backgrounds. I have, as I told you, my one grandfather on my mother's side. My grandfather on my dad's side, he was married 4 times. My grandmother, he left her when he was a deacon of a church and married the head of the choir, and they left, right? He too later came to have a deeper understanding of faith and understanding. But I looked at that and I said, wow, that's crazy, right? My father, because of that, he grew up as a Quaker in that household, but then they changed and they went to Assembly of God. A little bit different extremes there. And they kind of landed around Presbyterian, right? So when you would ask them what they believe, what are their things that they find revolting, boy, that would be really hard, because for those who know denominations, those are pretty extreme differences, right? Pretty extreme differences. When my mother's mom remarried to my grandfather, Mike, who I much consider to be my grandfather for many, many, many years, and for my whole life. He was a first-generation immigrant from Slovakia. Grew up strong, hardcore Catholics. So much so that he was a hardcore Catholic that when he met my grandmother and wanted to marry her, he took his proposal or his argument all the way to the Pope to get permission to marry my grandmother, a divorced woman with 2 children. The Pope told him no, so he told the Pope to take a leap and became a Methodist. So when we went to church on Christmas and Easter growing up, which later just left at Christmas, which later eventually led to not going at all, I started off in a Lutheran private school, right? And then we kind of went to some Methodist stuff, and then we kind of didn't do it at all. And when I got baptized as a senior at the University of Wyoming, and I started going to church, I was mainly going to Bible studies, and I'd go to our equivalent of the Cats for Christ because I didn't need to go to church. I didn't need to go in there and stuff like that. And my mother, even though I was going to 2 Bible studies and sometimes to church, her guidance to me was, don't get too churchy. Don't go too much. You'll become one of those people, right? And so that was kind of the teaching that I was taught with, the Gentile thought. And so as I do more studying and I do more reading, I think to myself, what do I find revolting? What are the things that I look at and I say to myself in a church, having been to one or two different churches in my day, what are the things, why am I here? Why do I believe what I believe? There's cards in the back of the pew that our elders have gone through, and they've said these are the things that our congregation believes and stuff like that. And I can say personally, from a Dwayne Byerly viewpoint, I agree with those, right? Nothing bothered me more than when I would go to a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church, a Pentecostal church, that was weird, right? A Lutheran church, that the organ was playing so loud that all I could hear was the organ, and nobody was singing. Right? Nobody was lifting their voices up in praise and worship to God. I love that about our church. I find it revolting when I went to an Assembly of God church with my great aunt and uncle when I was in high school a couple of times, that everybody had their hands up and they're clapping, and whew, I am not a charismatic worshiper. And I find that personally revolting. I don't like it. It just makes me uncomfortable. I'm not that kind of a worshiper. Doesn't mean it's bad. I don't know. For me, it is. Right? When we look at what it was talking about the Samaritans, I look at this kind of stuff, and this is what I take from it. And when I look at some of our denominations of Christianity, and let's not kid ourselves, denomination means divided, right? It does not mean united. It means divided thoughts. This is the stuff that I see, and this is one of the things that I look at and say, man, am I living that way? Am I believing this? Because I don't know if that's exactly right. I look at that and I say to myself that it screams to me of other denominations. I don't need to name them. I think we could all know it. My brother was invited to a wedding of which he couldn't go into the temple because he wasn't in the book, right? And I look at that and I'm like, well, is that really the way Christianity is supposed to be? Verboten unless your name's in this log somewhere. So I kind of find that a little bit revolting in things that I stand upon. And I look at it and I say to ourselves, how many of us lived in mixed households of faith? I know when I went through my plethora of ladies that I dated in my life, I never really ever stopped to think what it was that I was looking for with a spouse, right? And then when I finally pulled back the brakes, saw the light, if you will, and started to reflect, there were things that I said, this is what I find revolt. These are the things that I will not compromise on, right? And for Dwayne Byerly, one of those things was, must have the same faith, right? And why is that? Because I had so many friends and so many people that I knew that they found the love of their life. And he was a Methodist and she was a Catholic. And then they had children. And then what? Then it became a fight. And it became difficult. Right? And I know there are people in this congregation that are struggle with this, right? That one believes this and another believes that, and they got the children that are pulled in between and things of that nature. And how hard that must be. And as I think of these Samaritans, I think to myself, that's what they were doing. Right? So these Jews that had this faith, and then they're marrying these pagans, the Gentiles, were they going to worship the calf, or were they going to worship God? How was that going to work? And I wonder how kind of internal conflict that must have brought amongst them, right? But it's a thought. And so when I talk with my children now, I have this discussion with them quite often. Think about it. Think about these kind of things before you get yourself emotionally attached to someone. And deep into something like, what do you find, what are you willing to compromise on? What are you willing to do with that? What do I stand for when it comes to my faith? What are the things that I stand on and say, thus I will not cross? Personally for me, I have no problem with a December holiday and its grandeur and all the traditional things that are mixed in with it, but the one that happens in April, March sometimes, I have a hard time with. And I've told my wife numerous times, I do not want to mix this. We are Christians because of the resurrected Christ. Without that, we're Gentile pagans, believing in this dude that lived, that did some cool stuff and that water trick outside of the boat was awesome. But what does it really mean? Right? You know what I mean? So what are those things that I stand for? And I'm trying to push that down to my children, to have that understanding, full well knowing that Luke 12 tells us what? He was here to divide, not to unite. That 4 out of 5 will stay. That 2 out of 3 will stay the faith, but there will always be that lost one that goes away. That brother against brother, parents against in-laws, that there's going to be this divisive thoughts and just these things that we talk about. What's those things you find revolting? What are those things that you stand for? Right? And it's a difficult thing. But as Ray often says, when I think of conflict and arguments and things of this nature, is this a personal infliction that it's a personal thing that I find revolting that I can't deal with? Or is this a faith thing that's going to keep me out of the kingdom of heaven and keep me from salvation? And so I asked, when we think about these kind of things, or when I think about these things, I try to bring it back to that whenever I get jaded, like I feel like I've been crossed or I've been, something negative has happened to me. Or I'm talking to somebody that's of a different denomination, if you will. Is this a salvation issue or is this an actual personal thing? Because I've got some very, very good Catholic friends that I have no doubt in my mind that they have as fervent belief in Christ Jesus as I do. They go about their worship completely different, right? Things of that nature. And then I say to myself, what's required of me? What's required of Dwayne Byerly daily in my walk with Christ? What am I supposed to do? The biggest thing, and that's where it is. I've been looking all over for this. Spend the time in the book. Why did I stick with the Church of Christ? Why did it stick with me? Because when I was sitting in those Bible studies, trying not to get too churchy, every time I'd ask Mike Christensen, "Hey, Mike, I don't understand this. What's this?" He goes, "I don't know, Dwayne. Let's look. Here, open your Bible up. Let's look at Matthew, whatever. Let's go to John, whatever. What does it say there?" And we would read it. And he would say, "So what do you think of that?" And then we would discuss it. Nowhere else that I went was that the case. Right? It was Bible-based. It was right here. I keep saying this time and time again and everything else of that nature, and your class today brought a new light to it, that there's a reason to understand the Greek. There's a reason to understand the Hebrew understanding of words and things of that nature. Right? There's a place for that, right, as you dive deeper and deeper into this. I know when I first read John 4, it had a complete different meaning to me than as it is now, 22 years later as a Christian man reading this. Different things came out of it. That whole sarcasm thing of the Samaritan woman, that just kind of came to me through discussion and more reading. I was like, wow, yeah, that makes sense. And when you think of it in that way, it changes the whole meaning of that verse, of that whole chapter, right? But what's required of me is to have Christ-like love, a desire to understand, a desire to keep learning and to educate myself, to spend time in the Bible, to spend time in prayer, and flowingly, graciously practicing and giving forgiveness. Not of just others, but also of myself and my lack of understanding, my lack of at times, compassion, lack of wanting to understand. And seeing things from different viewpoints to a certain extent. But the beautiful thing that we have today that they didn't have then is we have hindsight through the book, right? We're able to read over that interaction of that Samaritan woman, of Peter denying Christ 3 times, and say, I'd never do that, right? Because we can reflect upon it. We can learn from it if we spend time in the book and we spend time in the Word. And I know I don't do it enough. I'm sure there's a multitude of us that don't spend enough time in it, doing and learning. But that's the only way that you're going to find out what are those things that you find revolting. What are those things that you're saying, on this I stand and I will not compromise. These are the things that I want for my family and my children and my wife and I. And these are the things that we are going to instill and incorporate to draw us closer to Christ, closer to God, and hopefully securing my salvation so that I'm not going to the dark, forbidden place of Sheol. Right? And so that's why I had Samuel read that verse, because we need to learn, we need to teach, we need to keep growing as Christian men and women, as followers of Christ. And the biggest and largest thing that we are supposed to do is precisely what Christ commanded us to do. He commanded his disciples to do it, but it applies to us. I have a brother that loves to debate Revelations. Wants to talk about all this stuff. What is the horned dragon and the horses and the apocalypse and these drums and cymbals and all that? What does all this mean? And he'll go back and forth with you forever. And finally, years and years ago, I don't like discussing it. It's a book of the Bible that we should know and we should seek to understand. But in the end, we win. That's what Revelation is about. Keep the faith. We win. Fear not. It's going to suck. It's not going to be fun. There's going to be persecution. You're going to be divided from family members. You're going to be causing rifts in friendships and things of this nature just by following Christ. Following this. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have all of the deep understanding of scholars that have been into this for years and years and years. But if you study this and you let yourself be taught, not just by the Word, but by the Spirit coming into your life, you can't go wrong. You can't go wrong. So as I wrap it up today, I hope you think about these things. What are the things you stand for? What are the things that this is your line in the sand that we shall not cross? And I hope all of us go forth, make disciples of all nations, starting here, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to follow all that he commanded. He, Christ, commanded us. And behold, know that he is with us wherever we go, throughout the ages of time. If you keep the faith, you keep going, he will be with you. And that is tremendously powerful, regardless of where we may be. That's all I have. So, if you need anything, you feel like being baptized today, come forward as we stand and sing.